All right, so here's a misconception that is, and maybe what you just explained helps me understand it. The steps that one has to go through, including the training and the leadership development to become a sergeant major, I think you said was the highest enlisted rank you can achieve. And what's the lowest officer rank? Is it a lieutenant?
Second lieutenant
Second lieutenant. So
in the Army.
the popular myth is the second lieutenant is a clueless boob who comes in and tries to tell the enlisted men underneath him or her what to do. And the sergeant major knows 10 times better, but the lieutenant doesn't listen. And so there's conflict between the officer and the enlisted men serving underneath them, just because maybe of the training that they got up until that point. But this idea that you have from outside the military, that the junior officers are clueless and tyrannical, and the enlisted people underneath them know better. Is that A, true? And B, is it a function of how long it's taken you to get to those respective roles when they come head to head with each other?
I will say that once again, it's a subset of society, right? You have bosses that come in that got put there for whatever reason, not necessarily for their ability, that aren't very good bosses. They don't know what they're doing. And the people who have been doing the jobs underneath them for a long period of time actually are familiar, a lot more familiar. And I think you can see that in just about everywhere. Ideally, they're choosing the right people for the right jobs, but I don't think that always happens. I don't think anyone thinks that. Now, in the military, yes, your second lieutenant will never probably, it's a weird dynamic, because while the second lieutenant outranks the sergeant major, he's never directly in charge of a sergeant major, because the different ranks of officers are usually in charge of a different subset of people. So a second lieutenant and a first lieutenant are usually in charge of a platoon, all right, which is 30 guys, and his counterpart, his enlisted counterpart, who's also responsible for the platoon, is a platoon sergeant, which is usually a sergeant first class, which is a E7. So there's 9 ranks, a sergeant major being an E9.
Okay.
And so when you have an E7 in charge of a platoon, that E7's got 10, 12, 15 years. You know, the fastest you can make an E7 is 7 years. Doesn't happen. Most people take longer than that, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I've seen that too. And some people retire as E7s because they never make any more rank than that, whenever, depending on how fast they got promoted and what how much of a go-getter they get and what their profession is and stuff like that. So you have this E7 on purpose, who's got a lot of experience, who went through all the ranks and knows all the positions and knows it's like being a parent, right? Your kid tries to get away with stuff that you did when you were a kid, so you know what he's doing, Since you've spent 12 years and done every position, you know where new guys are failing, so you can be there when they do fail and make them learn from it. You know where guys try to get over and try to hide from responsibility, and you intervene. And the lieutenant doesn't always know all that, so that's why you are his counterpart. However, ultimately, the officer is the one responsible for the failure or success of the unit. That's the way they do it. However, usually, unless the platoon sergeant can prove that he told the officer not to do it, and the officer did it anyway, and then they failed miserably and someone got hurt or killed or something bad happened, then usually the platoon sergeant and the platoon leader are the ones that go together. They usually get punished together because they're both considered to be in charge. However, I've seen it where the officer is the one that goes down, and the enlisted guy is like, he did what I did, right? Where I wrote that guy every week and said, this is what I'm doing. And the officer's like, I want you to prioritize this. And you're like, Roger that. But I really think we should do this. Like, no, do what I say. Okay, I'm not going to prioritize safety this week. And then someone rolls a Hummer, and then you're like, oh, you didn't let me inspect the Hummers like I wanted to, sir. So now ideally they work as a team. And most of the time I think that's true. And the second lieutenant is fresh out of college or one of the academies, or just went to OCS because he was prior enlisted. That's your ideal guy. He already knows the enlisted world, and so he only knows what. Now ROTC and academy has enlisted people as instructors, So ideally, the officer is going to respect these guys because a lot of his instructors were enlisted, and they gave him good advice on how to, listen to your platoon sergeant because he knows a lot. But, if you're responsible for the success and failure of the mission, so you need to make decisions based on all the input around you. So listen to your platoon sergeant, but make your own decisions, right? That's kind of how that works. And I would say, your officers, normally, not always, some of them are really, really smart and they really pay attention. They really got attention to detail and they know the job. If they really are really good leaders, they'll know the job just as well as the soldiers, if possible, right? They'll dig in. I've had SF officers like, I want to know everything about explosives. I want to know everything about commo. I want to know everything about, now, are they going to be, is any of that officer going to come over and do an amputation? No. Will he be able to assist me with the amputation if he's given enough time to train him to be my assistant and make sure that he's, aseptic and everything like that? Yes, probably. All right. But I don't expect anyone to be doing an amputation except for the medics. And I don't expect anyone to, plan a big demolition mission like, hey, we're going to blow this bridge up. Where are the places we're going to set the demolition and how much demolition are we going to need and stuff like that? That's the duty of the demolition expert. Now, will the officer learn how to place the demolition in that? Once you've identified the spot, will he know how to place it in there and get it ready to blow up? Yes. So he'll be able to assist with all that.
I was just going to say, when you're talking about the process that you go through as an enlisted person to move up the ranks from E whatever to E9 or E7, does a similar emphasis on training and leadership development occur as you move up the officer ranks? So can I assume a general must be supremely qualified, because you don't get to that unless you really.
They go to command schools all through their thing. So the first and second lieutenant, a second lieutenant is usually a platoon sergeant. A first lieutenant's kind of like it can also be a platoon leader. So they're in charge of 30 people, a platoon for infantry, right? Mm-hmm. Every profession has a different amount of people in a platoon. Okay. But I'm just talking infantry combat, there's 30 people usually in a platoon. You have a platoon leader and a platoon sergeant, an E7 and an O1 second lieutenant, or maybe an O2. Okay. All right. The next level is a captain, which is an O3 for an officer. He's in charge of a company, 200 people. His counterpart is an E8, which is a first sergeant. All right. And that guy's already been a platoon sergeant, and he's also done staff work, because it doesn't get promoted to first sergeant right after he takes a platoon. He does staff work and other jobs, and then he gets selected above. I mean, we're talking about top 5% of the Army make it to E8, right? Mm-hmm. Something like that. So they make it to a first sergeant, and then their counterpart's the captain. Then you have a major, which is usually a staff guy, and a lieutenant colonel is in charge of a battalion. All right. A battalion is 3 to 4 companies. So we're talking 8,000 people, that he's in charge of. His counterpart's a sergeant major. All right. Then the colonel can be in charge of like a regiment or division, things like that. And that he's in charge of like 3 or 4 battalions, and he's in charge like 5,000, but his counterpart is also a sergeant major, but a sergeant major who has already been experienced at a battalion level. And then you can go up from there, right? So basically, once you get to battalion level, that's the sergeant major, and then the sergeant major he never gets any more promotions or anything like that. He has to have experience here before he can serve here, before he can serve here, before he can serve here.
This may be a dumb question, but is there any way to shortcut the process? Can you come in at a higher level? Does someone get a political appointment? Is there any way for there to be a senior, either enlisted person or officer who didn't come up through the ranks?
So some usually the enlisted go through the ranks, all right? Unless they transfer from another service, and they may have another deal. They may have a deal doing that, but that's like, those are unique things that happen. Like captains, or I'm seeing doctors may come in at a higher rank depending on their contracts and stuff like that. Like a neurosurgeon coming out of medical school after he did his fellowship for 5 years and his blah, 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 he's already 30. They may say, okay, you're a lieutenant colonel or whatever. Because really when you're talking about the medical service in the military and the lawyers too, you're talking about pay.
Yeah.
Because they're not really in charge of anyone.
Right.
They're not running a formation and saying all the nurses do this. There's the head nurse, just like in a normal hospital. There's a head nurse running the nurses. Then there's the doctors doing the doctor things, and the nurses work with the doctors and they figure it out. They do their thing, right? But he's not like he's not like did you do your PT today? Did you fill out your paperwork? There's other people that do that that are in charge of that stuff. So.
Right,
so
but if rank drives pay for certain professionals who've put in, 8 or 10 years of training, you're going to want to find a way to pay them, which means giving them a higher rank, even though that didn't happen the same way that other people.
Right, and doctors will get promoted faster than infantry guys just because they're out. If they got out, they'd get more pay. So you're trying to keep them in for the 20 years at least, and that's why they get big bonuses. They'll be at a certain rank, but they'll get like 100, depending on if they're a neurosurgeon, they may get $100,000 bonus at the end of the year to keep them around and stuff like that. So that's all that. I don't know how that works because I never was obviously in that, but I've heard about it and seen it and things like that. The enlisted guys can. So when you come in the military, if you're a what's the highest a Boy Scout could be?
Eagle Scout.
If you're an Eagle Scout, you can come at the 4th level as a specialist, an E4. You can skip all the privates and come out as an E4. If you do at least 2 years of college ROTC, you can come in as an E4. If you do 3 years of high school ROTC, you can come in as like a E2 or something like that. They change it every year, but there's a bunch of little things like that.
What did you come in as?
I came in as an E3. I had a year of college.
Okay. All right. So this has been helpful. And I have one more question I want you to end with, Randy, and it might take you a few minutes to answer it. But for me, it is an illustration, this whole discussion of almost certainly the superficial information we have about any topic is going to be exactly that. It's going to be superficial. It's likely going to be wrong. And therefore, if you want to avoid being passionately wrong, you should at least keep in the back of your mind a little open point that says, you know what? There's detail, there's nuance, just like there is with any job, any profession, any topic. If you talk to somebody who actually knows it, you're going to learn a lot. So don't assume, just ask a few questions, right? It's much easier than trying to be, passionately wrong. So the last point I want to ask you about is something you mentioned earlier, but I want to add on it. And that is, you said if you get the expert shooting or whatever, pass the test, you can get a badge you can put on your uniform. So this is a two-part question. One is, what you see a general standing up in some public setting and they've got a uniform on and it's festooned with badges and ribbons and colors. Those all mean something, but I have no idea what any of them mean, any of them at all. So what would you see on someone's uniform? And the other part of the question is, when and where can you wear what uniforms? You have a dress uniform, I guess, what's that good for? And then you have, I guess, your other uniform. What do you actually wear when you are on base? Are you wearing civilian clothes, military clothes? And, the final part of this question is, I've been flying more again, and every time in the US airports, the pre-boarding goes according to their certain priority. And the very first one they're listing now is active military in uniform. But I've never seen anyone actually get on a plane as such. When are you, as a military, an active serving military person, allowed to wear your uniform out in public, and what sort of uniform can you wear? So maybe answer me some uniform questions. This isn't a misconception so much as I just don't understand the rules.
All right. So first of all, every service has different uniforms, which is, in some cases, it makes sense because they have different uses for it. And in some cases, it doesn't make sense. And they could probably save a lot of money if everyone just used the same color uniform, right? So when I came in, everyone was wearing the BDUs, which were the camouflage things. And then when we first started going to Afghanistan, we had the DCUs, the desert uniforms. And then somebody thought it was a good idea to buy the ACUs, which the camouflage didn't match anything. It was retarded. And someone made a lot of money off a really stupid idea. And everyone in the world thought that. Everyone was like, what are you trying to camouflage? What are you doing? It's dumb. And then they just started adopting the last 5 or 8 years, the OCP uniform. So these are the camouflage uniforms with the little, kind of baseball cap kind of thing. And those are your everyday uniform for most people. For most people, that's what you wear every day. If you're sitting at a desk doing HR stuff, you'll put that uniform on after you do your physical training, and then you'll work 9 to 5 and take an hour off for lunch, and you'll be in that uniform. Depending on what's going on in the world and, on the base commander's guidance, you may or may not be able to go off the base in that uniform. There was a time when you could wear that uniform on a plane, because after 9/11, they thought if they saw more military people on the plane, they would be intimidated and they wouldn't try to blow it up, crash it, or whatever. Then they went back to, you can only wear the dress uniform on the plane if you want to wear your uniform. And then they got to, hey, we don't want you to wear any uniform because we don't want you to stand out and make yourself a target. So it depends on, the atmosphere and the arena of what's going on as far as what you wear off the base. Usually the Navy has a crap load. They have like 10 different uniforms. I never understood what they wore, when, where, but most of the time it's dictated by the person in charge of you. And he says, hey, everyone needs to be in this uniform for this ceremony, for this function. Like I said, BDUs are usually the normal for everybody, unless they're working. Like my last job was at a very high level where we worked with a lot of ambassadors and foreign generals and things like that. So it was accepted that you wore your dress uniform all the time, because you're expected to wear, kind of a suit level thing, which is what the dress uniform is supposed to represent. And it's funny because we were allowed to wear our BDUs as military people when we weren't expecting a diplomat or a foreign general. And the dress code for the civilians that were working, I had about 50-50 civilians, military where I worked, their dress code was, suits. And there was always this complaint that, hey, if we have to wear suits, then you should have to wear your dress uniform, because that BDU uniform is not at the same dress level as a suit. And we have to get these cleaned, and we have to wear these hot things all day in the Italian heat, which, because I was in Italy at the time, and you get to wear, something that's just kind of, it's basically jeans and a t-shirt. I mean, because this is the same uniform that, I would inspect my Hummer before I go drive it. I get underneath it, check the oil. This is the same uniform that I would use to go do an obstacle course, So, why would you be able to wear that uniform that you use for everyday jeans and t-shirts and then use it every day if I'm required to wear a suit? And there was always this conflict of, how can you require me to have this standard of dress and you're wearing that? And we'd always go back and forth on that and stuff like that. So when you would have special functions like dining out, where they would have military funds would pay for a military ball or something, and you would be required to wear a dress uniform. And there's different levels of dress too. There's the long tie, the bow tie. There's the nice blue jacket with big things down the sleeves. And so those are, but you're not required to buy all those, especially as an enlisted guy. You get issued your dress uniform, and you get issued 4 of your camouflage uniforms. And then every year you get a uniform allotment of so much money. And you're required to maintain, like if you start wearing out your uniforms, you're required to buy a new uniform with that money. Or if there's a change in the uniform, like we all get new dress uniforms, like we did every 3 or 4 years, then you have to buy a new set of those with this money. And it was about $300 or $400 a year, I think, something like that. And so if you didn't have to buy anything that year, then you could spend it on whatever you wanted, just knowing that at some point you were required to maintain your uniform. And if it started getting all stringy and raggy, you had to buy a new one. If your boots started getting, falling apart, you had to buy new boots. And that was your uniform. If you took care of your stuff, it would last a little longer. But ultimately, you were required to use that money to maintain your uniform. And there's no reason why you should have a raggy uniform, because the Army is giving you money every year to do that. Did that answer all your questions?
It answered part of them, what the uniforms are, where you wear them, the badges and the medals I still want to hear about. And then maybe a related question as I hear you talking, which is, maybe this is a two-part question, we'll come to it afterwards. I want to understand, do you wear any of your stuff now that you've retired? Did you take your camouflage stuff and is that part of what you wear on the way to the gym? Or do you have to give it back? How does it work? Is it acceptable to wear it? Is it weird to wear it? Do you have special stuff from your special forces that only other special forces people would recognize? I can analogize a little bit to runners, even though I know it's a totally different thing. If you finish the Boston Marathon, you get a special jacket and other Boston Marathon runners would know it and recognize it. So you totally can spot another marathon running nerd by virtue of what they wear in their private time, either their shoes or their hat or their jacket. Can you identify other soldiers or former soldiers based on what you see them wearing in their private time? And would you do that? Or you understand what I'm asking?
Yes. So let me address the retirement thing. I don't know. I think I'm allowed to wear my uniform for events. Like if I'm asked as a guest speaker, I would have to look. I don't know the answer because I don't plan on ever doing that. And I don't really care. So I don't know the answer to wearing it after I get out of the military. I do have my uniform. I mean, the only problem is that the uniform I had when I got out is probably not useful now because they probably changed. In fact, I know they changed the dress uniform since then. So I would have to either, if I really wanted to get involved, I'd have to get a new one. And I'm not sure I want to spend the money on that.
But your old one?
Well, the old one is it's not being worn by anyone. I mean, so what they would do is they have an expiration date on that uniform. And then after a certain date, you have to wear the new one.
Uh-huh.
Now, because I got out with the old one, would I be able to wear it? Maybe. I don't know. I don't really know. I never looked into that, so I don't really know. I did get to keep my dress uniform. I got to keep all my uniforms. I got to keep everything that touched my skin. So I got to keep all my uniforms, all my boots, and all my hats. So I have all of those, and I gave them to my son. He may be able to use them for a couple of years. But he's a lot taller than me, so he probably won't ever be able to use them, to tell you the truth.
Didn't want to keep the hats, for example, and wear those around to...
Well, first of all, I live in Europe and I probably don't want to draw attention to me. And even if in the States, I probably didn't really want to draw attention to myself either. I didn't like to wear the ball caps. I never wore ball caps anyway. I am of the opinion that the reason people, lose their hair early is because they wore ball caps and they didn't allow sun to get to it. And they had all that sweat was clogging their pores. And that's why they lost their hair. And as you can see, at 55, I have some good hair still. And I wore my hat as least as possible. So
how are you identifying yourself as a, Green Beret Ranger? Do you have tattoos? Do you just put it under your shirt and you don't?
I don't have a tattoo either. So I'll get to that. Hold on.
You're blowing up my misconceptions about the military here.
A lot of it's funny though, because you spend enough time in the military, you see the rhythms. Like there was a time, there was a new guy in charge, and he said, "No one can have tattoos. You can't have sleeves. You can't have a wedding ring tattoo. You can't have anything below your forearm. And anyone who already has it is grandfathered in, but nobody who came in can get new ones." And then they would say certain jobs weren't allowed to have it. Like maybe, I think for a while, Delta Force was like no tattoos. You can't even apply if you have tattoos because they didn't want any marks to identify you with and things like that. So it's a rhythm. It depends on who's in charge and how much everyone's forgot what happened 20 years ago, because when they made that rule for the tattoos, the whole army rebelled and recruitment went way down. And they're like, oops, okay, we take it back, but I never got a tattoo. I never found anything I wanted to live with for the rest of my life. So I never put anything on myself. The badges. So for the Army, probably for almost every service, the most the most common and most well-recognized badge is probably the airborne badge, which is put right here on this side and on your left breast. And it's a badge that has like a parachute on it. And that means you went through airborne school and you're airborne qualified. Okay.
And airborne means parachuting.
Parachuting, right? You went to the 3-week parachute school and you, at one time you were qualified. You lose your qualification after 3 months. If you're not in a unit that requires you to jump all the time, then you'll just have this badge, but you won't jump again. And then if you don't jump within a year, then you become unqualified. You have to go through a refresher course in order to jump out of an airplane again if you ever want to, or you go to another unit or something that allows you to jump or something like that. And you get extra $150 a month for jumping out of airplanes. So for a guy that's, you're making $2,000 a month, that's another 10% of your pay raise kind of thing if you want to do that. Probably the next most recognizable and common is the Ranger tab, which is it's basically a half moon shape that goes right here on your shoulder, on your left shoulder. And that means you went to Ranger school. And Ranger school, it changes every couple of years, but it's usually between 8 and 10 weeks long. And it usually has 3 phases, what's called a city week, a mountain phase, and a jungle phase. And jungles takes place in Florida, and the mountain phase takes place in Dahlonega, Georgia, in the mountains. And then the other one takes place in Fort Bragg. And at one point they had a desert phase, which they discontinued right before the Desert War for some reason. Yeah, it was really bad planning. But anyway, I went to the one with the desert phase, and that was in Dugway, Utah. So that's a very common one. It's the premier leadership school of the military. You teach how to lead people when they're tired and hungry and don't want to do. When you say
common, I think you mean recognizable, not that a lot of people do it, because
it's so there's a lot of people that go to airborne school that never jump out of airplanes after they go to airborne school. They got it as part of it was kind of a incentive, like, hey, we'll send you to airborne school if you join right now. And they're like, yeah, but you only jump those 5 times and you never jump again because you're never in a unit that jumps. And Ranger School is a leadership school, so it's most recognizable probably is the tab that goes right here. A lot of people, a lot of infantry combat force officers will always go there. Senior enlisted that are like sergeants and above that are in infantry units and stuff will go to it. Sometimes some of the other services go to it. It's considered, if you go through it, you're supposed to come out of there and you're squared away. You're a good leader. You know how to articulate instructions, to follow up on your subordinates and make sure they're doing the right thing to standard. And it teaches you how to do this in high stress situations and make sure you can get the work you need out of people when you need to. The next one would be the Special Forces tab, which means you went to the Green Beret course, which is anywhere from a year to 18 months, depending on what job you end up getting. And so those are all recognizable, and pretty much any service will see those. And then you have
did you say the Special Forces is a year to 18 months? A lot longer than Ranger school then?
Yes.
Why is it so much longer?
Because a Ranger school teaches you a skill set, leadership skill set, and the Q course, we call it the qualification course, teaches you a job. Like when you go to the Special Forces medical course, you're basically a emergency trauma doctor. I mean,
so does this mean less people, and probably a lot less people, go to Q course compared to Ranger school?
Yes. If for no other reason than it's so much longer, right? So, a Ranger class starts every 2 weeks, I think, or something like that.
All right.
or maybe every month at least. I don't know if it's every month or every 2 weeks, probably every month. There's probably 13 a year or something like that. The Q course probably starts, maybe they have 3 or 4 a year that start, and then they have a 50% failure rate or something, depending on the profession. Like the medical course has like a 75% failure rate, I think, or something like that. I'm kind of grabbing these numbers out of my head because it changes every year, but it's pretty high. I mean,
Okay.
I failed the first time. I had to go twice to the medical course, but literally you're learning a college level A&P class, like a gross anatomy class in 6 weeks, 8 hours a day.
There's a little
And
bit, I mean, that's one of the misconceptions as well, this sort of macho or crazy expectations required to finish these courses. It's not for the faint of heart.
no, I mean, the medic course is like some serious, like the reason people fail is because they didn't do well in college and came in the army, or they didn't want to go to college. And now all of a sudden they're taking like
Compressed college.
no, seriously, I remember being 2 months into the course. I just gotten like, today we're going to learn the bones of the body. There are 206 bones of the body. But memorize them, you know, and then for 2 days you go, what's this bone? What's this bone?
Oh
You
my
know,
God.
and then 6 weeks later, you're looking at a cadaver with little, just like the movie Gross Anatomy with Matthew Modine, with pins in it, and you got a clipboard, and you're like, okay, that's the liver. Number 4 is the liver. Number 3 is the spleen. Number 2 is what is that? I don't know what that is.
How well do you remember that stuff now, just as an aside? Has any of
So,
it stuck with you, or how much of it?
so I guess the real question is, do I need to know the names of all 206 bones to do first aid, to do an amputation, or do I just need to know the procedures, what to be worried about, how to stop infection, you know? So
you're saying you remember useful things?
well, most of our training as a special forces medic was oriented around trauma. Okay.
Mhm.
However, we got a crap load of medicine classes, like, you know, what are the signs and symptoms of like really rare diseases or even common diseases? And how do I tell the difference? Does he have malaria, or does he have, you know, whatever? And so I have to like kind of differentiate it. And they also teach me how to use all my medical books. I have a library that comes with me, and eventually I had a computer. So, you know,
You didn't have to remember everything, right?
I had to remember it for the test. But
Right, but then afterwards you had
Right.
it's like for lawyers, you got to remember a crap load of
Right.
stuff for the bar exam, but afterwards you would never do something from memory. You'd look it up.
Right. And that's the point, right? You're familiar with a lot of stuff. You're like, I think there's this thing that starts
Yeah.
with an S, you know, and then you look, and they got so many great books now that you look at the signs and symptoms and it helps you zero in, or you type them in a computer program now. And it's like, it could be the following things. And then you just kind of rule them out by doing labs and stuff like that. So the fact that you can differential diagnose, you know, you can say, hey, you can do a physical exam, ask the right questions, like, where's the pain? When did it start? How long has it been going? What does it feel like? Blah, blah, blah. And you can zero in on the problem and not ignore other things that are going on systemically with the body, and then come up with 5 possibilities, rule them out with different labs, and come up with the most probable. And then not to mention, we have doctors. I'm a phone call away, especially nowadays, from a doctor in the rear, a surgeon, like, hey, I got this guy's pissing blood. These are the things and I had this problem with this guy was pissing blood. And I was like, he came to me, I was like, I'm pissing blood. I was like, a little bit of blood, a lot of bit of blood. And he holds up this Coke bottle and it's like bright red. I was like, oh, okay. So I'm like, all right. So then we do a history. I do it different. And then I call the doc back in the rear, because this is serious. And I'm like, hey, man, so this is what I think it is because of this, and this. He's like, all right, did you check this? And I have a bunch of lab shit too. I have like, I'm going to draw blood. I stick it in this thing, and I'm like, because I don't have a, whatever those things are.
Centrifuge.
I don't have a centrifuge. I am the centrifuge. And then I'm looking at that
mixer.
That's right. And then I'm like, put it on a slide. And I'm like, okay, there's so many, you know, red blood cells per so many. And that means it's normal. That means it's above or below. And I'm doing all these things by myself. So it's really, we'd love to hear what you think. So please comment on the show with your thoughts.
We read all of your comments.
Thanks for joining us and thanks for subscribing. See you next time.